If you enjoy watching Common Ground online, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at lptv.org. Lakeland Public Television presents Common Ground, brought to you by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
Welcome to Common Ground. I'm your host, Scott Knudsen. In this episode, tour the historic Clearbrook Depot, learn the efforts of its restoration and the treasured memories it holds.
Hello, my name is Randy Berger. This depot used to be my home. In 1961, I moved here with my father, who was the depot agent. And we came here because of the oil trains were coming to Clearbrook. I was born in Thief River Falls, a town of approximately 10,000 people at the time. So when I moved to this town of Clearbrook, which was probably less than 500 people at the time, it was quite an experience for me. But there were so many activities that, the hunting, the fishing, the lakes, and work here for my father, that I could watch him work. When I was growing up in Thief River, he went to his job and came home. But when I moved to this depot, I got to watch everything he did. The town had many more businesses running at the time, so it was always fun to go downtown. And where we're standing today was a baseball field where I would play baseball. And now they put a senior citizens home here. And the creek down here was where everybody would go swimming in the summertime, and they would play hockey in the winter. The oil trains brought in oil every day, and there were 2 oil companies working here at the time. So it was a major hub for oil. But also important was the grain coming out of the elevators from the farmers. And another important component was the pulpwood. My father would order gondola cars. Gondola cars are box cars with the top taking off. So they would put the pulpwood in them. And that was very prominent here too. Well, for the most part, this room was probably the most important part as far as business is concerned. Many of the business transactions took place right at this particular window here. This also became a place for the passengers to stay warm. And at noon in the wintertime, the track crew would always come in here and warm up. But again, this was the center of activity downstairs here. But the second floor, the upstairs, is where we lived. And it's a 2-room apartment in which we spent the winter of '63 and a short time before that as well here. But it was an exciting time to see what was going on down here, which affected upstairs. As an example, my mother would always be making coffee, and we'd always bring it down to the people. Keeping it clean was important. My father would always, say, pick up after your stuff, especially down here. The family was a representative of the Sioux Line uptown, so we were asked to participate in sports and Boy Scouts. So, we tried to integrate into the town just like any other family would. The wintertime probably brings the most fondest memories, people being in here warming up. But again, the amount of business that took place at that window was, the money that transacted, and sometimes it got to be quite a bit. And so my father had a safe in the other room. At that time, a lot of paperwork. So we did a lot of taking the garbage out and burning paper and stuff on that order. Living in such close quarters upstairs, it was a little difficult, because we had 5 kids and 2 adults, my parents, and the space was limited. So we had to compromise in many situations. One of the other things was there was no running water. We had to go out back and pump our water and bring it upstairs. Probably the most prevalent thing that sticks to my mind was living in Thief River. I had an indoor facilities bathroom. When I moved here, we had outdoor facilities. So that was quite a unique experience. So when it's 20 below and you're outside going to the bathroom, you don't waste any time. My father's name was Russell Gilman Berger, but he always used R.G. Berger when he signed all the paperwork for the railroad. And he worked for the railroad for 43 years. And I have a picture of his retirement. I think it was in 89 or 90. And I do have also pictures of him at work, sitting at his office doing his paperwork. And normally there was an agent and an assistant, or we'd call an operator. Normally it would be two people working in a depot like this. Well, they maintained each other, but when the trains were coming, they always had to maintain somebody at the telegraph, the device which gave information from one to the next. They didn't have telephones as prevalent as they do today. So they took train orders, and those train orders were passed to the engineers as the train went by or as the engine went by. So they'd know which cars to pick up in which town and which cars to drop off. So there was always a written order for them to follow. I came from a railroad family, and my grandfather emigrated from Norway in the late 1800s to Grafton, North Dakota. At that time, his brother was living there. And so he had a place to go, but as soon as he got there, he got a job on the Sioux line. He worked on steam engines. They sent him from a town of Adams, North Dakota to Thief River Falls to get his training, which in turn eventually became the roundhouse foreman for Thief River Falls after 20 years of being there, working on engines and maintaining these things. To maintain the engine, one of the main predominant things is maintaining water in the steam engines. Every 60, 70 miles, they'd have a water tower. And why they came to Clearbrook because of the vast amounts of water in the creek down here. In fact, the Sioux line made the little dam, so there was a reservoir for them to get water for the steam engines. This is a picture of my grandfather, Russell's father, Christopher, and his mother, and then he had one brother. And this is the depot which my father worked in for 20 years before he came to Clearbrook. And this is one of the steam engines that my grandfather maintained. And again, he would take care of the oiling. There's many places they had to oil the water, and you had to have fuel, which was coal at the time. So they had two people in the steam engine, the engineer and the fireman, they call them, keeping the water boiling enough to have steam to keep the locomotive going forward. I talked about earlier the orders they give to the engineers. This is how they would pass these orders to them with this device. I think you have one in the other room if I'm not mistaken. But they just hand it up to them, and it was on a stick with a triangular string, and they'd put their arm through it, and the string would let go, and they'd throw the stick down, and your orders would be there for the engineer. And these pictures, again, are of my father doing his office duties, and a lot of it was public relations, working with your customers and with coordinating everybody. And you not only coordinated in your town, but you also coordinated with the main office in Minneapolis. So there was a lot of things that everybody knew what everybody else was doing and keeping track of time. Clocks were very important in that era. They always maintained the same amount of time. They'd set their clocks every day. One of the things that you would see when you were on the railroad is, in fact, I have in my hand right here, is a railroad watch. Everybody would have one of these, and you'd coordinate. This happens to be a Kansas City Railroad clock, or a replica of. If you found a real one, it would be quite expensive. A lot of times they had their own special watches made for themselves. And you'd always see the people with their chains hanging. My father was trained as a telegraph operator before he was inducted into the Army during World War II. So they put him in a depot. And he was sent to Europe to dispatch trains. When you get drafted into the Army, at least even in 1970 when I was drafted, we all took a test on the telegraph. And so that probably gave him a real strong in during World War II, that he could do that, and that was so important. I'd like to take you on a tour of the Clearbrook Depot. Here is the lobby where most people came and did their transactions. This window over here where all the business took place. A lot of money and a lot of paperwork was done at this place. I can remember my father having a money drawer on the other side. And at the time, there was a oil heater here that kept this room warm, and many people come here to warm up during the day. And as an example, I mentioned the track people would come in at noon to warm up, and there was a lot of activity, business activity, and where people would talk, and a lot of coffee was drank, and day's activities, the train, what it's bringing, what it didn't bring, as far as freight is concerned. And there was, again, the transition of the oil companies working here. The oil trains would come every day. And before I came here, they had the passenger service. I think that stopped in 1959. But I can also tell you, when I was living here, that one of the operators, the assistant to my father, would practice his band in here. They had a rock and roll band back in the early 60s. So every once in a while, maybe once in a week, you'd have them practicing here. So when I was 10 years old, that was pretty cool. I'd like to go into the office here where my father worked. And what you would find in here are the daily activities of the people that brought their business here. And this window here was where a lot of the paperwork and money was transacted. And this spot right here is where I remember my father sitting the most, using his telegraph and keeping track of the trains and communicating. And I always remember him looking out like this through these side windows, looking for the train. You have to have a visual reference too. And there was always busy. There was sounders that would enhance the sounds of this telegraph.
Was it a mechanical device?
It was a mechanical device. It was well, this is a sounder in its own right, but it would have been much larger.
Oh, it's like a relay that clicks.
Yeah, to relay the sound, exactly. A sounder was a device that enhanced the sound of the telegraph. So you could hear it all over the room. So he could be standing over there and hear what the message was. And at the time, there was a big box right here. And there was just like a street light. It stopped green, yellow, and red. And the engineers would have to follow that. If that light, which was hanging above 20 feet in the air, you seen a red, he would stop, because he didn't have radios at the time. And I remember one day, the train was busy and my father was going on about, and I had my youngest brother was taking the switch and he was turning it from red to yellow to green, back and forth and back and forth, and the engineer didn't know what was going on. So he stopped his train and he came, and then my father found out, but my brother was doing that, but it was lucky because at the time there was what they call a hot box, where a bearing on the axle of the boxcar was so hot that was, sparks were coming out, which would have resulted in a derailment if they didn't stop. So they fixed it. So even though he was playing, it was for a purpose. Yes, that was kind of unusual. Maybe God had some intervention in that. Okay, a lot of the paperwork was done here, and of course the typewriters were used quite often. I don't remember them doing too much handwriting of stuff. All the orders to the trains were on typewriters and duplicated. There's always carbon copy papers here, and so that became quite a mess at the end too, that my siblings and I had to clean up at the end of the day, but of course we got a little money for it. But again, you get to watch your father work. But there were also other people in here that you got to interact with. And I think I learned a lot through my father, through public relations, being down here that young. Okay, well, public relations skills is important, but he also taught me a lot of safety factors being near the depot. As an example, when a train would come, we'd go out on the loading deck. And my father would go into high mode, stay away from that train, stay away, go stand by that depot. He would always make sure that we didn't get close because he knew the tragedy that would take place if we even got near it. Because as a train goes by, it creates a suction. It can actually suck you over like that. And a small child could possibly be, brought into the train. But it was very, very important for him to get, he didn't want to lose a child. This is the freight room where they stored a lot of the things. One of the most personal memories I have is that my father had a lot of carpentry abilities. And when we lived here, He bought a plywood Luger boat kit, it was called, in the early 60s. So he bought a kit made out of plywood and put it together in this room with glues and hammers. It was a kit. It made a 16-foot runabout. So a boat was built in this room right here. Most of the packages that were sent here were stored in here until the customers came and picked it up. This was cold in the wintertime, I remember, so didn't go in here much. But in the summertime, we played in here too. In the spring and fall, of course, it was in here. But again, most of it was my father didn't want us in here so much so it wouldn't disrupt things. I can understand that too. When things are shipped, here's a cart that they would unload off the box cart onto these things. And then they would pull this into here. And each depot had stuff like this. But again, you don't have to worry about tires wearing out with these. And at the time, there was another bigger storage facility on this side of the building, which isn't here today. Again, for more storage. Not only stored freight, but a lot of the stuff that the railroad needed, the parts for the tracks and things in that order. And then they maintained their heat. And when I lived here, we had to maintain the water well outside and make sure that it stayed flowing in the wintertime because there was no flowing water here. I had the opportunity to live in 3 different towns, and there's always different, personalities, different things that you have to learn. And I think that's probably the most important thing I learned is public relations skills and the ability to work with people, which translated to what I became a school teacher. And I think that had an important impact because you have to communicate with many different people in many different situations. And there was a lot of fun times listening to my father talk to his peers. They'd always joke and make, tease each other about, Joe did that, or so that was kind of fun. You're learning both sides of the fence. It's not all business. There's fun. You have to enjoy life. I think they did here too. The position my father held within this depot meant a lot to the people uptown. He seemed to, not only here in the depot, but when I'd go uptown with him, they would communicate with him, and he'd be involved in different activities uptown. So, you got to know the person who you're dealing with when it comes to your paycheck, and he's got a part for you that you need. You want to stay close to these people. And I think that's probably one thing that people should realize. And the fun that took place here, the joking, I think that's important. This was the main hub where all the activities took place. Everything was shipped through here. And again, it was transportation. If you didn't have a car or a horse, if you were going to go any long distances, it was all by rail. Now this is the loading dock where most of the activities took place for the depot of the shipments of freight being transferred from the railroad cars, which would be sitting 3 feet away. The cart that was in the other room would be brought out and brought over to next to the boxcar, and then the freight would be transferred from the boxcar to that cart, and it would be transferred to the freight room. When you bring a boxcar load of freight, it takes a lot of room, and it takes men to move it, and often the section crew or the people who worked on trucks would help with the big thing. So it was, a center of attention. When the train came, everything got busy. From transferring of freight, the cars being switched to the elevators, to the pulpwood. So, there's a lot of stories being told here, and a lot of laughter I recall being, maybe some jokes I shouldn't have heard. One of the things I remember seeing is my father. I still can see him in my mind's eye today. He'd be looking out that window, looking for trains, looking for customers, looking for his children. Well, let's go upstairs to where the living quarters were in this depot and where I grew up. To the door here and to the right, many times as a young child, I remember running up and down these stairs and falling a few times. And I wasn't the only one, even though there's plenty of spaces. Okay, up here we're coming into the dining area. Like most homes in the North Country, this is the center of activity where most things took place. From family activities, talking to work-related experiences and frustrations. Much of the time was spent here. With a family of 5 children, there wasn't much space to live up here. The unique thing about that is that when you're young, you're smaller dimensionally. So this looks like a big place. It doesn't look so small like it does to me today. Of course, this is where most the family activities took place. This room is where my parents had their bedroom. And then most of their activities, whatever they did there. But probably even more important is this room right here is where we would use it as a bathroom slash shower or bath, taking a bath. When you look in here, it's just a small little room, but that's where we'd take our baths in galvanized tubs like your grandma would have. And of course you'd have the, not the commode, but a honeydew pot, whatever you want to call it, that, where you do your business if you didn't want to go outside to the to the outdoor biffy. One of the activities in any family is the cooking of the meals and the activities that surrounded it, dishes and so forth. And I often remember watching television in the living room and watching my mother prepare meals and her activities, her sewing, her writing, and things on that art. So it was, a living quarters, living room slash kitchen slash just about everything. One of the unique things about living in a depot is that the tracks were only 10 feet away. So you would think that when these trains go by at 30, 40 miles an hour, they do make a lot of noise, but you adapt to that and you can sleep through it, which is kind of, you wouldn't think all the noise you hear a train makes, but you become accustomed to it. Of course, you also remember the movements of the depot when the train came by. You could feel it shake a little bit because of all the heavy weight that it's went by. I believe my mother had a similar stove to cook on. Again, that was the center of our day, was when Mom made meals. This is the living room where we had a black and white TV, and this also became the bedroom for the boys after everything quieted down. We'd had a fold-out couch, and we'd be sleeping in the chairs. And again, we had a black and white TV, so that was our main entertainment. And this last room here to your left is where my 2 sisters had their own room. Again, when you're small, your conception of size, versus adult is makes a difference. But it seemed to be plenty of room at the time. And, and I don't remember any major fights other than any other family went through. But again, we had the television and the activities that were going on with the family. And a lot of times we did go spend time at the lake, Pine Lake and Clearwater Lake. So we did have a lot of activities away from the depot on the weekends for our recreational time. And this is just a phenomenal area for recreation. Clearbrook with the lakes and the woods and hunting and fishing. I still come back to do that. I didn't realize until I was thinking about it how important it was for me to grow up in a railroad family. I didn't realize that at the time how important it probably was. As I talked about earlier, all the people could come here for their freight and their activities, but so you do become, they know who you are. And when I come back here and say who I am, oh, you're the guy that lived over at the depot, isn't it? I said, yeah, I'm the one that lived over there, yeah. So, people remember me being here too. And I think too, living second story above was unusual too, where most people, maybe an apartment, but most homes you're level. So there is kind of uniqueness when you look out the window and you can see down the road a little bit and what's taking place, who's coming, or should I open the door or shouldn't I? And then I brought friends up here like everybody else would, play as much as you could. And so again, it was all unique experiences for the people, for my friends and my siblings' friends. So again, it was just like any other home, other than it was on the railroad tracks and a story high. I can't express my thoughts when it comes to how they have preserved something that's so special to the community, but it also touches my heart because I lived here. Not only my heart, but my siblings and my parents talked about it. Again, it was just like any other home. You build yourself around it.
Thank you so much for watching. Join us again next week on Common Ground.
If you have an idea for a Common Ground piece that pertains to North Central Minnesota, email us at legacy@lptv.org or call us at 218-333-3014. To view any episode of Common Ground online, visit us at lptv.org. To order episodes or segments of Common Ground, call 218-333-3020. Common Ground is brought to you by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people November 4th, 2008. If you enjoyed this episode of Lakeland Public Television's Common Ground, consider making a contribution at lptv.org.